Okay. Hello. How's it going? This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. Welcome and thank you for listening. This is posting on the first day of the new year. And there's a deeply ingrained impulse in me to want to say, Happy New Year to you. But as I believe I've discussed on this podcast before, I sometimes feel like happiness as a goal puts an undue pressure on us. Happiness is very fleeting to me, and I don't know if I say, have a happy new year, and you don't, what does that mean? So what I prefer is to wish for you joy. Because to me, joy is not the least bit contingent on happiness. I can be very sad and still joyful at the same time. It's like a thread that runs through it all and helps me feel human. So that I most certainly feel good to wish for you, that you would have a joyful new year. And I am still in Virginia. I'm recording this just a couple days before it's going to post. I'm still hanging out with my in-laws. In fact, I am under quite a bit of a constraint to make this happen with you today because my wife did not stick to our plan, and so my time that we had set aside for me to do this recording, it got smaller and smaller and smaller, and just only a few moments before hitting the button to record this, my little 3-year-old daughter was in here, and I was trying to record this with her in here because she wanted to be in here, and she was doing a wonderful job. She was being so quiet and so sweet, but I couldn't do it. I felt a little too self-conscious, and I couldn't seem to make it happen. And then when I started to make it happen, she coughed because she has like a little bit of a cold. And I'm like, this isn't going to work, sweetie. So she just walked out and the door closed. And here I am with you. And, I have been reflecting a lot on the last year. 2017 was a lot in so many regards. And it's so arbitrary the way we classify time like that, We just decide, tomorrow is number 1, and we start over in some way. It's really just a psychological thing, I always remember when it became clear to me that time is an entirely arbitrary construction. It was when I took this very infamous trip to India that I've talked about as well. It takes 3 days to get to India. Like, you leave on the 1st and you arrive on the 3rd. But then when you come back, it takes no days. You leave on the 1st and you arrive on the 1st. And I just remember thinking, how's that possible? How is it possible? And I know you can talk about time zones and equators or whatever, but I'm just saying theoretically it's impossible. If it takes 3 days to get there, it's got to take 3 days to get back. So in any case, it is an entirely arbitrary thing that we do when we classify time in the way that we do. But at the same time, there's a psychological thing, right? It feels good to have this sense that, okay, we got through that year, and now we're going to start this one fresh. And I think that's good. I like that feeling. I embrace it. I've got a lot to do in this coming year. So I'd like to go into it feeling in an optimistic way. Like, I'm going to manage to do everything I need to do. And I'm going to have a thread of joy throughout. So I am wishing this for all of you, my friends. And I want to take this moment to also express some very deep thanks. I've been getting some wonderful emails, and I've been meaning to read some of them, but today's podcast with Seane Corn is kind of long. We talked for a while, so I'm going to try to wrap this up, and I'm not going to read any emails today, but I am in the coming weeks, because what's going on out there with you guys and sharing that with me in relationship to the conversations that are happening on this podcast is just thrilling, and I'm so grateful to you for listening and taking the time to reach out to me. Please feel welcome to do that. As I mentioned, today's podcast is with Seane Corn. I've never met Seane Corn before, but it was real easy to talk to her, and we went all kinds of amazing places. I've been thinking a lot about things that she says in this discussion, and I was just really grateful to have had the opportunity to connect with her, and I am very excited for you to hear it today. Before we do, let me drop my stuff. I'm going to be in London, January 12th through 14th. I'm going to be in Nidau and Bern, Switzerland, January 20th through 22nd. I'm going to be in Armonk, New York, February 3rd. I'm going to be in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, February 16th through 18th. You can find out about those gigs and more, and listen to the archives of this podcast, and read my blog, and find my online yoga video offerings, including my live stream subscription, which is available 24 hours a day. All of that stuff can be found at jbrownyoga.com. Maybe you would show some support for the podcast and go to a blog or podcast page, make a direct donation, or go to iTunes and write us a review and give us a star rating. That stuff helps, and we sure appreciate it. We've got some very exciting things going on coming into this new year. I am going to tell you about that stuff some on the other side. But for now, like I said, we've got a lengthy talk to get into with Seane Corn. Hello?
Did it work?
Oh, it worked.
I'm a genius.
Oh, we finally made it happen. You know, I've had a few technical hiccups doing the podcast, but this one was really, really gremlin-esque. I don't know what was going on.
Yay! All right. Well, we did it.
We did.
Are you going to be able to record it through FaceTime?
Yes, that's fine.
Right.
That's why it's a little bit better than just trying to use the cell reception, which was kind of dropping on us already. So I think we're good to go now. It's beautiful that things sorted themselves out. Thanks so much for being so flexible and helpful.
Sure, of course.
It's just super cool that I get a chance to talk to Seane Corn.
Oh,
because we've never met before, but we have.
Is that true? How have we never met?
I don't think so. I mean, that's cool that you even would know any idea who I am, but I certainly know who you are. We have a lot of mutual friends and acquaintances, and we just passed each other. Like I landed in New York in 1990 and took my first yoga class at Jivamukti on 2nd Avenue in 93.
Oh,
94,
really?
and then started teaching in 95. And you were there earlier, 87, and then you left in 92. So you were leaving right as I was...
You're sounding a little stalkery.
I'm sorry. I'm only knowing. I'm sorry. I don't mean to be stalkery. I'm looking at your bio. That's all.
Okay.
I'm looking at your bio because I was getting ready to talk to you, and I was like, look at that. She was leaving right as I was starting there.
Yeah. I came to New York in 1984, but I started yoga in 86.
I see. Well, it's super significant for me, and I'm sorry if it seems like I'm stalking you. I didn't mean to be creepy, but
Not at all.
The reason why I did maybe even a little more preparation than I sometimes do for these podcasts is when I started this podcast, 2.5 years ago, I started it with a list of people, a pretty short list, maybe 25 names. And my idea was, I wanted to do this podcast because I wanted to have conversations about how yoga went from kind of being this underground to mainstream thing. And I wanted to talk about it in the context of personal stories because my coming into my adulthood paralleled that. And so this list of names were people that like I sort of identified as they seemed to, that happened for them too. And they were like kind of examples of things that happened with me. And you were on that list.
Wow, well, that's very cool. That's very, very cool. Well, I'm glad to have this conversation. I look forward to it. I'm sure there's a lot of parallels in our story, especially if you were in New York and that's where you learned yoga. I can imagine we walked similar pathways.
Well, the other thing is I grew up in Los Angeles. So when I look down and I'm looking at your bio, please don't get creeped out.
Creepy.
I see that you were, I don't know if you still are, living in Topanga, California?
Yep, that's where I live.
You see, as soon as I see that word, I grew up in the San Fernando Valley.
Oh, yeah? Where?
Canoga Park, Woodland Hills.
Yeah, sure. Mm-hmm.
And I used to, there was like a couple of summers, I was pretty young, maybe 14, 15, and my friends and me, we would ride our bikes to PCH through Topanga Canyon.
You would ride up that hill?
Yes, you see, what we would do is we would tough it. It was like literally 3 miles up to the top of Topanga, and there was that sign that said top of Topanga, and you could look out over the valley. And then from there, it was literally 7 miles down to the beach.
Oh, God, but then it's 7 miles up.
Well, that was another, we would come back a different way. We would come around a different way. But ultimately, like for that whole 7 miles, you didn't have to pedal once. It was all downhill, but you had to tough up that 3 miles to get there.
Oh, God, that's just crazy. And first of all, it's so dangerous because there's really no room for a bike. And any of the idiots that are driving down Topanga, they have no idea what's around the corner.
It was so stupid. And we were like getting stoned. It was terrible. It was bad. It was really stupid and dangerous. But at one point we realized it. Like we went and we saw somebody got in an accident and we were like, oh my God. And we all like we stopped doing it after that. We sort of realized how dangerous it was. But I say that because I was flooded with memories when I thought of you in Topanga. And how is Topanga today? Is it like sunny and warm there this morning?
Yeah, it's gorgeous, of course, because, we're above everything. So it's like we can't tell what's really going down at the ocean right now. It could be all hazy down there, but we're kind of right now above the cloud line. So it's really pretty and it's really warm. You're missing everything.
Well, we could talk about that kind of differences between New York and Los Angeles.
Sure.
But I know that, I came from Los Angeles to New York. And, the thing that I think about also when I think of you, and another reason why I really wanted to talk to you, why you were on that list, is for me, you're an example of something that's kind of commonplace now, but it wasn't back then, which is when like a yoga teacher isn't necessarily like identifying themselves with a particular lineage or guru and uses their like personal story to provide the context for what they teach. Mm-hmm. And you were someone who was doing that like kind of before other people were doing that. And I certainly have modeled that as well. And sort of like as a teacher, for me, it was the only way I could feel comfortable trying to take on that role was like this kind of transparency about who I am. And that often that there's kind of like a initial wound that gets healed through yoga and becomes a teaching. Mm-hmm. And it seemed like that was true for you. I know I've heard you talk about your story and how, like me, when we first landed in New York, we weren't necessarily going in very good directions.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And for me, it was a very specific wound. My mother passed away. But I'm wondering for you, looking back now, do you have an idea about what it was? Like, what was the hole you were trying to fill? Like, it sounds like you had good parents and stuff. I don't know. Like, I'm wondering, like, do you have an idea about what it was that, like, was the initial deep wound that you had to address?
Oh my God, there were so many. Now, is this all officially? We're podcasting now.
Oh yeah, we're going. Okay. I hope that is okay. We're just
absolutely.
We're just talking. I like to sort of jump into it and don't.
Absolutely.
I try to.
Yeah, what I can tell you is that I wouldn't have known any of this when I got started. When I got into yoga, I was young and it was very circumstantial in that I worked at Life Cafe on the Lower East Side, which was owned by David Life, who then went on to open Jiva Mukti a few years later. and Sharon Gannon was one of the waiters there, and Eddie Stern was the delivery boy. And
yeah, he's been on the podcast before. He talked about working there and going to India with Sharon and David.
Well, exactly. So they all went to India together. I think it was around 86 or so. I had already been working there for a couple of years. I was around 19 at that time. And yoga was definitely talked about in the cafe a lot. But it was, it was so new. And I was like straight off the 197 New Jersey Transit, so the only thing I understood about yoga was from what I had seen in school books, and it was all very mythological, and I was also really anti-religious, and it screamed of religion to me. And so I wasn't really comfortable with a lot of the rhetoric, and they were doing a lot of practices of healing and wellness. I remember Sharon talking about the health benefits of a coffee enema. And me trying, like, looking at my cafe latte, thinking, how the hell did I get that up my ass? I was really that naive. And so I just didn't understand it. And yoga started getting introduced to me in different ways, even before I stepped on the mat. Like, of course, the principles of ahimsa, for example, with around veganism and animal rights. That was something that David and Sharon were already just starting to get passionate about. But the cafe at the time certainly wasn't a vegan restaurant, and it was, they're trying to, slowly get rid of any of the meat products, and I didn't really understand any of it, and I got on the mat at actually Integral Yoga on 12th Street was the first yoga class that I took, and at that time I'm doing drugs, I'm smoking, I'm drinking all the time. And so yoga just made me feel sick at first. And as my body, I guess, was processing and detoxing, I didn't really have an understanding of my own the depths of my personal wounding until probably around a year or so on the mat. I started to get glimpses of that I had some issues that needed to get worked out. And, for example, I had OCD when I was a kid. I don't know. I don't think that's in my bio, but perhaps it should be. But
no, I don't see it here. I relate. I have a bit of that in my family, and I'm functional, but I have a bit of touches of it as well.
Do you? Yeah. Well, I had it as a kid. It started around 8 years old. And now, of course, obsessive compulsive disorder would not have been it wasn't a diagnosis at that time. And certainly I didn't come from an environment that would have had me in therapy. It was just this quirky behavior that I did that my family both tolerated and indulged. And it wasn't secretive because I didn't know it's something I should be ashamed of. I wasn't informed that way, thankfully. So I was obsessed. I had compulsions around the number 4 and 8. And it was directly related to superstitions, meaning that I was raised in an agnostic, borderline atheist family, but I was a hypersensitive kid, and I picked up a lot of information around God through my very typical Christian, Catholic, Jewish community. And my relationship with God was really steeped in paranoia because what I was picking up from my friends and their family and my school was that if you messed up, you got punished. That God was very patriarchal. It was all-seeing, all-knowing, and that bad things happened. For me, I developed these superstitions that to prevent bad things from happening, I needed to do things in certain order. And it was also directly related to trauma that I experienced as a little girl and my nervous system trying to find ways to self-regulate. And so I would get really bad anxiety, but by touching things 4 or 8 times, it was able to stave off the anxiety. And also I could negotiate with God not to let bad things happen. It was very complex for a little kid. Now, of course, I'm not aware of any of this. All I know is that if I touch things or blink or swallow, or if people repeated words certain numbers of times, I would feel good. And if they didn't, I would feel bad. And so when I moved to New York City, my anxiety got worse because I was away from my support system, which was my mom, really. And I was in a very new environment. I was much younger than everyone else because I was 17 when I moved to the city. And just that environment and also the drugs and the drinking was making the anxiety worse. So my patterning also got worse. And I lived at 206 Avenue B between 12th and 13th. And I lived in a fourth floor, thank God. I lived on the fourth floor of a walk-up, and there were 56 stairs between the door and the bottom step. And I would have to count the steps every day, turn around, go back upstairs, count the steps, and check to make sure I locked the door. And I had to do that 4 times. And it became more chronic. And one day I was in a yoga class, and it would have been a David's class. And he accidentally kicked my right foot while I was in down dog. And when he kicked my foot, all of this anxiety came up in my body because I felt immediately imbalanced. My whole body felt out of whack, and I needed him to kick my other foot. And I kept obsessing on how I could get David to kick my other foot. And I started to plot, which is what I always did, that when I went to say goodbye to him, I could accidentally trip. And when I tripped, I could strategically kick his other foot with my foot.
You could just say, hey, David, would you kick my other foot for me real quick?
If only. But because it was always weird, and I was always trying to figure out ways to do it that it wasn't weird, but it was always weird. And what happened then, David said randomly to the class, he said, breathe and everything changes. And I took a really deep breath and exhaled it out, but nothing changed. And actually, it got worse. The anxiety, the panic got more accelerated in my body. So I did it again. I took another deep breath. Nothing changed. And I just kept breathing and breathing like that. And then there was this weird shift in my body. And I felt myself relax. And I was able to leave the studio without tripping over David. And that was a huge victory for me. So the next day when I left my apartment, I counted the 56 steps down. I turned around to go back up, and I stopped, sat on the bottom step, and kept breathing and breathing and kept watching the anxiety get worse and worse and worse. And the superstition, all the thoughts in my head, someone was going to die if I didn't do this, even though I knew that was ridiculous intellectually. My body was having a very different experience. So I just kept breathing, and then finally, it was maybe after 20 minutes, a half an hour, I don't even know, I was able to leave the building without going up those steps. And that became a huge part of my yoga practice, was learning how to breathe and self-regulate without having to go into compulsive behaviors. It wasn't enough, though. Of course, I had to get into therapy and understand the trauma and a lot of other things to really heal myself from OCD. But that would have been the first time I recognized that I had some deep wounding that the yoga practice excavated that was going to need to get dealt with.
And that's so interesting to me, too, because my experience was the same, where the initial thing that really hooked me on yoga was like this thing that happened with the way my mind was firing. Like you, I have a similar thing. It's not as bad maybe, but like I'll like lock a door and then turn around and then check that I locked it, and then have to check again even though I just checked it.
Yeah.
And then I learned to do a thing where I lock it and I say out loud, I say locked. And if I say it out loud like that when I do it, I can stop. I don't have to check a couple more times. But
that's
it's just
a good
something
one. That's creative.
It's just always, but it's interesting because it's like you invented like kind of these rituals for yourself as a kid. You know, these like tight rituals to follow that made everything feel like in order or whatever.
Yes.
And then you were bound by them. And then you used practices like breathing to become aware of those patterns and make a new pattern, which, see, to me, that's what got me into yoga, that thing of using kind of these sustained attention exercises to be able to have a little bit more say about what my mind does.
Yep, absolutely. Well, before I even got on a yoga mat, I had like my first experience of being able to quiet my mind. And it's actually, in some ways, it was dissociation, which I was also really good at. But it also taught me that through controlled breathing and focus, that I could tune out what was happening, the chaos around me. And the story there is, I was. Do you know the band False Prophets? It's a punk band back in the day.
I do. I was into the punk for a little while. I know the False Prophets, yes. Eddie talked about going to CBGB's shows on the weekends, the hardcore shows. Why do you bring them up?
Well, because I used to perform for the False Prophets at CBGB's. And what my job was, Stefan, the lead singer, he had these 4-inch nails that all curly cued, and he had this little weird Hitler mustache with these handlebars. And he used to come into the cafe all the time, and he was much more threatening looking than he actually was. He was a really nice guy. And he would pay me $100 to stand on the stage at CBGB's, and all my job was, I would wear a black bodysuit, black tights, and I stood on one corner of the stage, and there was another woman on the other corner of the stage. My only job was, for the hour that they were performing, that I stood absolutely still. And in the course of that hour, I had to turn my head from facing forward to facing towards the band, which for me, it would have been to my left. So it was just a quarter of a turn, but no one could see me move. Like, they didn't want anyone to see. They just wanted people to do their thing, and then all of a sudden they'd look and see that my face was now turning, a little bit different. It was just weird. But he said, no matter what the band does and no matter what the people in the crowd do, I couldn't react. And he said I was perfectly safe, no one would touch me, but that I couldn't react to the chaos. And so the first time I got on the stage, that band is insane.
Yeah, that's a crazy hard thing to do.
Yes. And but also I'm right in front of the mosh pit. So there's all this frenetic, chaotic energy. So what I did was I in the back of the room, there was a poster a Blondie poster. And I fixated my focus on this poster. And I would feel my feet on the stage. Like, I would separate my feet, like hips width apart. Now, again, I had never gotten on a yoga mat yet. I separated my feet hips width apart. I couldn't do it if I was wearing high heels. It only worked if I was barefoot. And so I would be barefoot on the stage. I'd focus on the Blondie poster, and I would breathe as deeply as I could. And what would happen was all the chaos around me would become narrower and narrower and narrower, and my point would become single pointed. And I would be able to focus on that point, and then every few minutes shift my gaze ever so slightly. And I could tell that it was like I was in the zone of this point, and that's it. And that became my first experience of really quieting the fluctuations of the mind and single-pointed focus.
And using your OCD in a constructive kind of way. You know what I'm saying? Like, being able to do that without any real training was probably because you already had a tendency to have that kind of hyper focus.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Wow. And it makes me think, and I'm sorry, I'm going to get creepy again, because I found this other thing that you mentioned, because it goes to, I'm always interested in what you just did, where you point to your first yoga before the mat, because I found that yoga started for me before the mat too. And I read something in an interview that you gave where you were talking about working at an all-male gay sex club, and a guy named Billy, and him being one of these really pivotal moments. So who was Billy, and what about that moment was so important for you?
It was all happening at the same time. That's why it's just life is just so fucking weird sometimes, because I couldn't have predicted any of this. Yet at the same time, I look back and it felt so contrived. Like, everything was just poking me in these directions. Yet it was Yet my experience is both very light and very dark. You know, working in environments where there's drugs and alcohol and, punk rock and living on Avenue B over drug dealers, like all of that, it was either moving me in a direction of self-destruction, but in my case, it moved me in a direction that really expanded my awareness about life, love, relationships, people. And working at Heaven was one of those moments also that I got a lot of slack for that. I was underage working as a bartender in this all-male gay sex club. That at that time, that seemed inappropriate, hedonistic, all this, a lot of judgment around it. And yet that experience became one of the greatest teachings that I have till this day ever been given, and really taught me about how to see guidance and, if you will, angels in the most unlikeliest of places. And that's what I learned at Heaven. Heaven was in Limelight. Limelight was a club in New York City.
It was like a big castle, right? Or something.
A church.
A big
it was an old
church, yeah.
And Heaven was in the rectory of this church. I worked in the disco, which is, the main area where, of the church. And that's where I worked most nights. And one day, though, I needed my manager for some reason, and I was running around the club trying to find him, and I heard music coming up a pair of, churches are, there's back stairs, there's all this stuff going on, and I'm not familiar with churches. And so I see this back stairway, I hear this music, so I run up there to see, what's going on, and I get stopped at the doorway, and he said, you can't come in, and I said, I work here, I need to find, the manager, and he said, you can't come in, and I said, why? And he said, I said, where am I? And he said, you're in Heaven. And I looked around and I realized right away, that there were only men, but a lot of the men were naked and dancing and kissing. And I could see that there were people tied up to the wall. There was shit going down.
And you're what? You said 17?
At that point, probably 19.
Okay.
And I'm looking around what is this? And anyway, I found my manager, and I've always been what one of my friends says, I'm a cosmic voyeur, meaning that I'm fascinated. It doesn't matter how weird it might be perceived. I want to know everything. I'm creepy. If you and I were hanging out, Jay, and you were telling me something about your life, I would ask you 10,000 inappropriate questions and hang on your every word, because I'm fascinated. And the more weird and bizarre it is, the more creepy I get, because I'm just fascinated by life and what makes people tick and environments. It doesn't mean I want to participate or get involved in any capacity, but I want to know. And I don't have a lot of judgment around shit. It's just, I just don't.
We got a lot in common. Welcome to this podcast.
So I was asking my manager 1,000 questions, and then the next day, I guess kind of as a joke, instead of working in the disco, he put me in Heaven, and that's where I worked for the rest of the time that I was at Limelight. And I was the only cisgendered person allowed in female. I was the only cisgendered female allowed in the club. And it was the best, really the best place that I could have worked. And especially being, underage and all of that, in terms of serving alcohol, I was so safe. These men loved me, wanted nothing to do with me sexually, and really protected me. And Billy was my true angel. And Billy, do you want to hear the story, or?
Well, I'm curious. I don't know the story, but it seemed like when I saw the note in the interview you gave, it was Billy was your angel who really turned you on the path that you are on.
Yes. Well, Billy is a well-spoken story, but I don't know who's, on this podcast. And if it's new to anyone listening, it's a beautiful story. And so I'll walk you through it in that. So Billy was this African-American man, probably around 58 years old, at the time. And, what I knew of Billy was that he had been a Baptist. He was from Ohio. He had been married, had 4 children, and he had grandchildren whom he had never seen. And the reason why he hadn't seen them was because when Billy came to terms with his sexuality, meaning when he discovered he was gay, he was ostracized, not when he discovered, when he came to terms with that truth. He was ostracized by his church, abandoned by his family, and really rejected from his community. And he moved to New York to really live out his truth. And although he was lovely and charismatic, he was also melancholy and lonely, and for whatever reason loved me. But he had a lot of issue with my drug use, and he would always give me a hard time about it. He was in recovery, and he used to wear this the inverted triangle around his neck, and would just give me a lot of shit about it, and which I always thought funny, because the first time I actually saw Billy, he was one of the people who was tied to the wall, and he was chained to the wall with a feather duster shoved up his ass. So I was like, I couldn't believe he would be, so critical of me when I was like, Billy, look at your own world. And so anyway, we were very close, and we would talk all the time. And then for about a 3-week period, Billy doesn't show up at the club, and which was very unusual. But there were no cell phones at the time. I didn't know where he lived. And when I would ask the other guys if they had seen Billy, they just really weren't helpful in giving me any information. So anyway, one day I'm working, the door opens, and I can see Billy, his silhouette as he comes through the club. And I'm so excited to see him. So as he gets close to me, I lean up onto the bar and I go to throw my arms around his neck to hug him. And what I notice is that he's got all these open sores on his neck, his shoulder, and on his face. So I stop right before I hugged him, and I said, Jesus Christ, Billy, what is that? And he touched his shoulder, and he said, they're symptomatic of my disease. And I said, of what disease? Even though I knew the answer, of course. And he said, I have AIDS. Now, this was in the 80s, and at that time, there were maybe, who knows, 40,000 reported cases of HIV AIDS, worldwide. Now there's 40 million. And even though I knew the population that was most affected by HIV AIDS, I was still young, too young, and young enough to have had an embodied reaction to when he used the word AIDS. I pulled back and I physically recoiled from Billy. And of course, which I immediately felt an enormous amount of shame. And Billy was I could see that he was hurt, but it wasn't the first time this has happened, on any level. And so he asked me if I wanted to know more about his disease, and I said, of course. And he explained to me how he thought he got it, and I asked a shitload of questions, and, could I get it if he kissed me, if he hugged me, if he cried on me, all the questions that you might ask. And I asked him if there was a cure, and of course he said no, there wasn't then, and there isn't now. And I asked him then what was going to happen, and he said he was dying. And I asked him if he was scared, and he told me that he wasn't. And the reason he wasn't was because of his faith. And when he said faith, for this, I recoiled again. Like for the second time that night, I kind of had a reaction. But this time Billy laughed, and he asked me if I believed in God, and I told him I didn't. And I explained why I didn't, and and I explained to him my rituals and my superstitions, and just being raised in both a Jewish and a Catholic household, and how my parents decided not to raise us with religion for a variety of reasons. And I gave him the whole lowdown. And I also told him how, because of my OCD, again, I didn't know about my OCD, but because of my superstitions, I just always had this feeling like if I fucked up, that I was going to get hurt, and I fucked up all the time. And so it wasn't a good idea for me to believe in God, because if I did, then I was going to have to live with the knowing that I was going to be punished because of the way I behaved with drugs and acting out sexually, all that stuff. So Billy, I remember he had the biggest smile on his face. And after a while, he said to me, Sean, do you want to see God right now? And I looked around and I said, here? I said, yeah, you show me God here. So Billy points to Danny the Wonder Pony. And Danny the Wonder Pony was this white guy that used to come into the club all the time, butt naked, except for a pair of chaps and a saddle. And for $1, you can climb on Billy's back, and he would trot around the dance floor, and you can beat him with a switch. And so he points to Danny the Wonder Pony, and he says to me, God's right there. And then he points to this person. His name was Violet, and at that time, Violet would have been considered a cross-dresser, not a transgendered person, and you wouldn't have given Violet the pronoun she at that time. You would have referred to Violet as a he, because that's just how it was done. And so Billy points to Violet, and now also Violet was the worst cross-dresser in all of New York City. And she was around 6'5", used to wear a light blue house dress, super sensible shoes, a little pocketbook, a gray wig with a hat and a veil, and looked very much like a 6'5" version of my immigrant Polish grandma. And Billy points to Violet and says, Sean, God's right there. And then points to these two gentlemen in a booth, and they were wearing suits, and they looked as straight as either one of my brothers, and they were kind of like playfully arguing over a pitcher of Bud. And Billy says to me, God's right there. And then Billy took his hand. Now, Billy was a big guy, and he was dark, and I'll never forget it, because Billy's hand was huge, and he takes his hand and he places it over my chest, and it's like his hand filled up the whole of my rib cage. And then he picked up my little tiny right hand and he puts it across his chest, and it's just kind of covering his heart. And he has his hands on both of our hands, and he presses our hands into our hearts. And he said, Sean, God's right here. He said, I'm going to tell you something now, and I hope you remember this for the rest of your life. He said, ignore the story and see the soul, and remember to love. You'll never regret it. And he said, Danny, Violet, these two men, you and me, it's all a story. He said, it's not who we are. He said, all of this, these are aspects of our experience, but they don't define us. He said, we're here to learn what love is. Love and truth, that's God. And he goes, and that's inside. He goes, everything else. He said, this is all just fodder for our experience to open ourselves to what love is and to who we really are. And it was in that moment that he made me see everything totally different. Ignore the story and see the soul and just love. And that was the single most important experience, that lesson of what, to me, where God is. It's in all beings at all times, in all moments, light and shadowed, that there's no differentiation between one being over another, that everyone is here just learning and growing and doing what they got to do to figure their shit out, to remember who they truly are, which is love. And if I can recognize that, then there's nothing more holy. And I realized later on in life that wisdom came to me in an old church, in an environment called heaven, by a black gay man in a sex club, that angels show up in really unusual ways, but in ways that each individual uniquely can hear. But to make no mistake, that everyone, all experience, every moment are lessons and angels and teachers and teachings meant to mature us and to evolve our own soul into our awakening. And of course, I couldn't have known any of that then. I didn't understand the impact of that moment until later on in life. Billy died about 3 weeks later. But
if you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.